She stumbled into the circle of iron wolves. 8 years old, head shaved raw, tears streaming. "My father did this," she whispered, touching her bare scalp. "He sold my hair for gambling money." Kodiak knelt down, his massive frame towering over her trembling body. "Where is he?" The little girl pointed down the dirt road. 20 engines roared to life. What happened next would change her life forever, but not in the way anyone expected. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The dirt road stretched out endlessly under the merciless afternoon sun, and 8-year-old Maya ran like her life depended on it, because in many ways it did. Her small feet kicked up clouds of dust with every frantic step. Her worn sneakers slapping against the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that matched her racing heart. The stubble on her head caught the sunlight in a way that hair never should. Raw, exposed, uneven patches where her father's trembling hands had wielded kitchen scissors just hours before. She couldn't stop touching it. Her fingers kept reaching up, feeling the strange prickly texture, the sudden absence of weight she'd carried her whole life. Gone. All of it. The long brown hair her mother used to braid every morning before school. The hair that fell past her shoulders and swayed when she ran. The hair that made her feel pretty when nothing else in her life did. Sold. Taken from her head and traded away for money her father would lose before the sun set. Her breathing came in sharp, panicked gasps that burned her throat. She'd been running for 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time had become meaningless the moment those scissors touched her scalp. The memory flashed through her mind in fragments. She couldn't escape her father's cold eyes, calculating and distant. Looking at her, not as his daughter, but as something he could convert into cash. The metallic snip of the blades, clumps of hair falling into his cupped hand. Then onto the newspaper he'd spread on the kitchen floor. Her own voice, small and breaking, asking him to stop. Him not stopping. The humiliation was a living thing inside her chest, hot and suffocating. He'd made her stand perfectly still while he worked. Told her if she moved, he'd cut her skin. When he finished, he'd swept up the hair into a plastic bag without looking at her face, without acknowledging the tears streaming down her cheeks, without seeing the little girl whose childhood he was harvesting for his next bet. But she was running towards something now, something she discovered that very morning while digging through the boxes of her dead mother's belongings that her father had shoved into the back of the closet. Too ashamed or too high to throw them away. She'd been looking for anything of her mother's she could hold, could smell, could remember her by. What she found instead was a worn black leather jacket folded beneath old photographs. And on that jacket was a patch, bright red and white, unmistakable even to an 8-year-old who knew nothing about motorcycle clubs. Iron Wolves. She'd opened the collar with shaking fingers and saw a name stitched inside in faded thread. A name she recognized from whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, from her mother's tear-stained letters she'd found years ago and never understood. Her uncle, a man she'd never met, never known existed, but whose brotherhood her mother had trusted enough to keep that jacket like a sacred thing. That's where Maya was running now. Toward the old gas station on the edge of town where kids whispered that bikers gathered, toward men she'd never spoken to, wearing patches like the one she'd left clutched on her mother's bed because she'd been too afraid to bring it, too afraid her father would see and take that from her, too. Toward the only hope she had left in a world that had taken everything. Her legs ached, her lungs screamed, sweat mixed with tears on her face, leaving tracks through the dust that had settled on her skin. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't, because behind her was a house that had become a prison, a father who saw her as inventory, a life where even her body wasn't her own. And ahead, somewhere in the shimmering heat of that endless dirt road, was something her mother had kept hidden for years, something that might, if she was brave enough and lucky enough, actually help her. If you've ever felt abandoned by someone who was supposed to protect you, drop a comment saying, "Never again." Let's stand with Maya right now. She ran faster. The old gas station materialized through Maya's blurred vision like something from a dream she'd had, but couldn't quite remember. The building itself was abandoned, windows boarded up, pumps long since dry, but the parking lot was alive with chrome and leather and the rumble of idling engines. 20 motorcycles sat in formation. Their riders gathered in loose circles, checking straps, adjusting mirrors, sharing final cigarettes before the ride out. The Iron Wolves patch blazed on every back, red and white against black leather, exactly like the one she'd found that morning. Maya's legs nearly gave out as she stumbled from the dirt road onto the cracked asphalt. Her momentum carried her forward past the first bike, past the second, straight into the center of their circle, and then everything stopped. The conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter cut off sharply. Even the engine seemed to quiet, though that might have been her imagination. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. This small, dusty, crying child with a butchered head and terror written across every inch of her face. The silence that fell was absolute. The kind of silence that happens when something so wrong appears in front of you that your brain needs a moment to process what it's seeing. Maya stood there swaying, chest heaving, unable to catch her breath enough to speak. Her hand reached up instinctively to touch her head again, feeling the stubble, feeling the shame of it. The bikers stared. Some exchanged glances, others seemed frozen, cigarettes halfway to their lips, words dying, unspoken. Then one of them moved. The largest man Maya had ever seen in her life. Easily 6 feet 5 inches, shoulders like a mountain range, arms covered in faded tattoos that told stories of decades lived hard. They called him Kodiak, though Maya didn't know that yet. All she knew was that this massive, terrifying man was walking toward her, his boots heavy on the pavement, his shadow stretching out long in the afternoon sun. She should have been afraid. She should have run. But her legs wouldn't move. And somewhere deep in her exhausted, traumatized mind, she understood that she'd come here for this. For him, for them. Kodiak stopped 3 feet away, studying her with eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness to be shocked by it anymore. Then slowly, deliberately, he knelt. His knees cracked as he lowered himself to her level. And suddenly, his shadow covered her completely, blocking out the sun, creating a small pocket of shade where she could breathe. His weathered face came into focus. Lined and scarred. A gray beard streaked with white, but his eyes were gentle in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. What happened? The words unlocked something in Maya's throat. The sob that came out was ragged, ugly. The sound of something breaking that had been holding together by threads. He shaved my head, she managed. The words coming in gasping bursts between cries. My father. He shaved my head and sold my hair. For money, for gambling money. The silence that followed was different now. Heavier, darker. Maya could feel it pressing down from all sides. Not threatening, but protective, like a wall being built around her. The other bikers had moved closer without her noticing, forming a tighter circle, blocking out the rest of the world. Kodiak's hands came up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. His fingers were thick and scarred. Knuckles that had broken and healed wrong more times than she could count. They stopped just short of her face, hovering there like he was afraid his touch might hurt her. "Can I?" he asked quietly. Maya nodded, unable to speak anymore. His palm settled gently against her cheek, rough and warm and steady. His thumb brushed away a tear, then another. He didn't look away from her eyes. Didn't glance at her ruined head. Didn't flinch from the rawness of her pain. He just held her gaze like she mattered, like she was worth seeing. "Nobody's going to hurt you now," Kodiak said. And it wasn't a promise, it was a fact. "You understand me?" Nobody. Hit subscribe if you believe strangers can show more love than family sometimes. The trolls defending deadbeat parents won't. Behind him, engines started roaring back to life. But this time, they weren't riding away. They were getting ready to ride toward something. The story came out in pieces, jagged and broken like shattered glass. Maya was trying to reassemble with trembling hands. Kodiak stayed kneeling in front of her, one hand still resting gently on her shoulder, anchoring her to the moment, while the other bikers gathered closer, their faces hardening with each word she managed to choke out. "It started years ago," she told them. Her father, Vincent, had always liked to gamble, cards at first, then horses, then anything that offered odds and the illusion of control. After her mother died 3 years back, the gambling went from hobby to obsession to addiction so complete it consumed everything in its path. At first, it was just money disappearing from the grocery envelope. Then the television vanished one day while Maya was at school. Then the good furniture her mother had saved for. Piece by piece, their home was stripped bare like a carcass picked clean by vultures. Maya remembered coming home to empty spaces where things used to be. The dining table her mother had refinished by hand, gone, sold to a second-hand shop for a fraction of its worth. The dishes with the blue flowers that they'd used every Sunday dinner, pawned for $40 that lasted Vincent maybe 2 hours at the track. Her school books, the ones with her name written carefully inside the front covers, disappeared one morning, and she never saw them again. He'd sold those, too, told her she could share with other kids, that she didn't need her own. The house became an echo chamber of loss. Every week, something else disappeared. The microwave, the good winter coats, her mother's jewelry box, the one with the dancing ballerina inside that Maya used to watch for hours. Vincent would leave in the morning with arms full of their belongings, and come home empty-handed. Sometimes with cash that would be gone by nightfall, sometimes with nothing but excuses and the smell of whiskey on his breath. But Maya was still just a possession he hadn't liquidated yet. Just another asset on a balance sheet, waiting for the right moment to be converted into betting money. That moment came 3 months ago when he pulled her out of school. Couldn't afford the fees anymore, he said. Couldn't afford the uniforms, the supplies, the lunch money, so she stayed home, hidden away in that hollow house. While other kids her age learned and played and lived normal lives she could only remember. The isolation was its own kind of death. No teachers to notice the bruises when he got angry about a lost bet. No friends to ask why she stopped showing up. No witnesses to watch her childhood being sold off piece by piece. She lived in silence, ashamed of what her life had become. Too afraid to ask for help because who would believe that a father could do this to his own daughter? Then came this morning. Vincent had been up all night pacing and muttering, checking his phone obsessively, watching sports highlights and calculating odds that never worked in his favor. He'd lost big the day before. Maya didn't know how much, but she knew the look on his face when the debt was serious. He sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, and then his eyes landed on her. Really looked at her for the first time in months. Not at her face, not at the daughter he was supposed to love and protect, at her hair. Long brown, beautiful hair that fell past her shoulders in waves she'd inherited from her mother. Hair that was thick and healthy despite everything else falling apart. Hair that Vincent suddenly realized with the cold calculation of an addict was worth money. Good money. Children's hair sells for premium prices, soft, undamaged, long enough to make quality wigs and extensions. He didn't ask permission, didn't explain, just told her to sit down, spread newspaper on the floor like he was preparing to gut a fish, and pulled out the kitchen scissors. Maya begged him not to. Cried, pleaded, promised she'd be good, be quiet, wouldn't ask for anything ever again. He told her to hold still, or he'd cut her skin. So, she held still while he harvested her like a crop, clumps of hair falling onto the newspaper in piles that represented her last connection to her mother, her last piece of dignity, her last shred of childhood. When he finished, he swept it all into a plastic bag and left. Came back 2 hours later with a handful of bills, maybe $60, maybe $80 that would be gone before dinner. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge what he'd done, just walked past her like she was furniture he'd already sold. But how did an 8-year-old girl even know where to find the iron wolves? That morning, while digging through her dead mother's things, looking for anything to hold on to, Maya found something that would change everything. A worn black leather jacket with a patch that promised protection her father never could. A name stitched inside that represented family her father never was. And suddenly, she knew exactly where she needed to run. After her father left with her hair bagged up like garbage, Maya sat on the floor of her empty bedroom, touching her butchered head and trying not to exist. The house was silent except for the tick of the old kitchen clock her father hadn't figured out how to pawn yet. She felt hollow, scraped out, like there was nothing left of her that mattered. That's when she remembered the boxes in the back of the closet. The ones her father had shoved there after her mother died, too drunk or too guilty to sort through them, too practical to throw them away in case there was something valuable he'd missed. Maya pulled them out one by one, desperate for anything of her mother she could touch, could smell, could hold against the aching emptiness inside her chest. The first box held photographs she'd seen before, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, her mother smiling in ways Maya was starting to forget. The second box was full of books, recipes written in her mother's careful handwriting, pressed flowers from a garden that no longer existed. But the third box, the one shoved furthest back and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age, held something Maya had never seen before. A leather jacket, worn and soft with years of use. The kind of broken in texture that comes from being lived in, trusted, worn like a second skin. But it wasn't the leather that made Maya's breath catch. It was the patch on the back, bright red and white, even after all these years. Bold and unmistakable against the black. Iron wolves embroidered in letters that seemed to pulse with meaning she didn't fully understand, but could feel in her bones. Her small fingers traced the outline of the patch, feeling the texture of the stitching, the weight of what it represented. She'd heard the name before, of course. Whispered on playgrounds, muttered by adults who didn't think children were listening. Spoken with a mixture of fear and respect that made the words feel important. Dangerous men on motorcycles who followed their own rules. That's what the other kid said. That's what made the adults nervous. But her mother had kept this jacket, hidden it away like something sacred, something worth protecting. That had to mean something. Maya's hands were shaking as she opened the collar, looking for some clue about why her mother would have this, why she'd keep it secret from everyone, including her own daughter. And there, stitched into the fabric in thread that had once been white but had faded to cream, was a name, Marcus Reyes, her mother's maiden name, her uncle, the one Maya had never met, never heard stories about, the one her father refused to discuss the few times Maya had asked about her mother's family. The pieces started falling into place like a puzzle Maya hadn't known she was solving. Her mother's protective silences. The way she'd sometimes stare out the window like she was looking for someone who never came. The old photographs Maya had found once showing her mother with a tall man in leather, his arm around her shoulders. Both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Her father had ripped that photo up when he'd caught Maya looking at it. Told her never to ask about that man again. But her mother had kept the jacket, hidden it where her father would never think to look, preserved it like a promise, or maybe an insurance policy for a rainy day she'd prayed would never come. And now here was Maya holding that jacket in a house that had been stripped of everything else, with a head shaved bare and nowhere left to turn. If her mother had trusted these men enough to keep this jacket for years, if she'd hidden it carefully enough that even in her desperate search for pawnable items, her father had never found it. Then maybe, just maybe, they were the kind of people who would help. Maybe they were the kind of family that actually meant something. Maya made her decision in that moment, sitting on the floor surrounded by the remnants of a life that used to be whole. She didn't fully understand what the patch meant or what the iron wolves were beyond playground rumors and adult warnings. But she understood that her mother had trusted her brother, had kept his jacket like a lifeline, and that had to be enough. It was all she had. She left the jacket on her bed, too afraid to bring it. Too afraid her father would see and take this last connection, too. But she memorized every detail of that patch, the exact shade of red, the curve of the letters, the way the wings spread across the back like protection she'd never known. Then she ran toward the old gas station where kids said bikers gathered. Ran toward men she'd never met, but whose blood she shared. Ran toward the only hope she had left. She had no idea that showing up with that patch would unlock something the Iron Wolves almost never do. That the name stitched inside that collar would change not just her day, but her entire life, that she was about to become part of something bigger than survival. She was about to become family. Kodiak rose slowly from his kneeling position, his knees cracking into silence. But he never let go of Maya's hand. His massive palm completely engulfed her small fingers, warm and calloused and steady in a way nothing in her life had been for years. He stood there for a moment, this mountain of a man holding the hand of a broken 8-year-old girl. And then he turned to face his brothers. No words were spoken. None were needed. The Iron Wolves had their own language built from decades of riding together, bleeding together, standing together against a world that rarely understood them. Kodiak's eyes moved from face to face. And one by one, the bikers nodded. Slow, deliberate nods that carried the weight of commitment, of understanding what was about to happen and accepting it without question. This wasn't a vote. It was a recognition, a silent agreement that some lines once crossed demand a response. A younger biker named Raven stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Maya with a mixture of rage and gentleness that somehow existed together. Marcus Reyes's niece, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. I rode with Marcus for 8 years before the cancer took him. Good man. Best man. He looked at Kodiak. She's got his eyes. Kodiak nodded once, then looked down at Maya. Your mama kept that jacket all these years. Yes, sir, Maya whispered. Then she knew. She knew if things ever got bad enough, you'd find us. He released her hand just long enough to shrug off his own vest. The leather warm from his body heat, heavy with patches that told stories of roads traveled and battles fought. He draped it over Maya's small shoulders where it hung like a cape. The bottom edge dragging on the ground, the weight of it both physical and symbolic. You're with us now, sweetheart, Kodiak said, his voice carrying across the parking lot so every man there could hear the promise being made. Nobody touches you again. Nobody. Maya's fingers clutched the edges of the vest, pulling it tighter around herself like armor she'd been waiting her whole life to wear. For the first time since her father's scissors touched her head, she felt something other than fear and shame. She felt protected. Kodiak turned to the others. "Mount up." The first engine roared to life. A deep, throaty growl that seemed to shake the very air. Then another and another. One by one, 20 motorcycles woke like sleeping dragons, their engines creating a symphony of thunder that rolled across the abandoned gas station and out into the world beyond. The sound was overwhelming, primal, a declaration of intent that needed no words to explain its meaning. Each bike that started added another layer to the crescendo, building and building until the noise was almost physical, pressing against Maya's chest like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Comment, ride, if you're standing with Maya against cowards who hurt children. Kodiak lifted Maya onto his bike in one smooth motion, settling her in front of him, where she'd be safe, where she could feel the rumble of the engine beneath her and know that this power was on her side now. The vest wrapped around her like a shield. 20 bikers sat ready, engines idling, waiting for the signal. "Let's go get your father," Kodiak said. The convoy rolled out like thunder given form. 20 motorcycles moving in tight formation with Kodiak and Maya at the lead. She sat in front of him, small and fragile against his massive frame. His vest wrapped around her like armor that was 3 sizes too big, but somehow fit perfectly. Her hands gripped the handlebars where his hands rested, feeling the vibration of the engine through her whole body, feeling the raw power of it and knowing maybe for the first time in her life, what it felt like to be protected by something stronger than fear. They moved through town slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see. And people did see, heads turned on sidewalks, car windows rolled down. Shopkeepers stepped out of doorways to watch this procession pass. This impossible sight of 20 iron wolves riding in formation with a small girl at the center of it all. The rumble of the engines announced their presence blocks before they arrived. A rolling wave of sound that demanded attention and got it. Maya recognized neighbors on their porches. Mrs. Chen, who used to bring casseroles after her mother died. Mr. Davidson, who'd asked once if everything was okay at home and never asked again. The Martinez family who'd watched her father load furniture into his truck at 3 o'clock in the morning and said nothing. They stared now, some with hands over their mouths, some with recognition dawning in their eyes as they realized who that child was, whose stubbled head they were seeing, what story was being written in real time on their quiet street. The whispers started before the bikes even passed. Maya couldn't hear them over the engines, but she could see lips moving, fingers pointing, phones being pulled from pockets to capture this moment. Let them watch, she thought. Let them finally see what had been happening behind closed doors while they pretended not to notice. Her father's house came into view at the end of Willow Street. Shabby and neglected, paint peeling, yard overgrown with weeds, windows that hadn't been washed in years. It looked exactly like what it was, a place where hope went to die. The porch sagged under its own weight. And there, sitting on the steps with a beer in his hand at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, was Vincent. He saw them coming. Maya watched his face from half a block away, watched the exact moment recognition hit him like a physical blow. The beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. His body went rigid. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a ghost of himself. All blood and life retreating to some deep place where it might be safe from what was coming. Kodiak guided his bike to a stop directly in front of the house and the other 19 bikes fanned out in a perfect formation. A semicircle that surrounded the property like a noose tightening. Engines still running, still rumbling, still promising something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Vincent stood slowly, the beer bottle slipping from his fingers and shattering on the porch steps. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Maya sat perfectly still on the bike, Kodiak's presence solid and unwavering behind her, his vest wrapped around her shoulders like a declaration of ownership that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with protection. She stared at her father and felt nothing but the vibration of the engine beneath her and the strange, sweet anticipation of watching a man realize his world was ending. Vincent had sold everything he could touch. He'd stolen his daughter's dignity piece by piece. Harvested her childhood like a crop, traded her hair for gambling money without a second thought. But he'd forgotten one thing: his late wife had never told him that her brother rode with the Iron Wolves, and that some debts come due in ways you never see coming. Kodiak raised his hand, and the engines cut off in sequence, one after another, until the street fell into a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. That silence was more terrifying than any roar could have been. It pressed down on Vincent like physical weight, like the air itself had turned hostile and was squeezing the excuses out of his throat before he could voice them. Kodiak dismounted slowly, then lifted Maya down with hands that were gentle despite their size, positioning her behind him where his body became a wall between her and her father. The other bikers dismounted too, moving with deliberate calm. No rushing, no aggression, just 20 men taking their time because they had all the time in the world and Vincent had none. They stood with arms crossed, faces unreadable, saying nothing. Just watching, just waiting. Vincent stammered, his mouth working, but producing only fragments. She doesn't. You don't understand. I was going to. His hands fluttered uselessly, reaching for explanations that dissolved before they could form. She's my daughter. You can't just. This is kidnapping. This is. I have rights. I'm her father. The bikers didn't respond. Didn't move. Didn't give him anything to push against or argue with. They just stood there. A silent jury that had already reached its verdict. And in that silence, something else started to happen. Doors opened up and down the street. Neighbors who'd been watching from windows stepped out onto porches, drawn by something they couldn't name, but could feel. Mrs. Chen came first, her hand pressed to her chest, staring at Maya's shaved head with tears already forming. Then Mr. Davidson, then the Martinez family, then others, people who'd lived on this street for years, who'd heard things and seen things and done nothing because it was easier to look away. But they couldn't look away anymore. Not with 20 Iron Wolves standing as witnesses, demanding without words that the truth finally be spoken. Mrs. Chen's voice cracked when she spoke. We heard her crying that night, 3 weeks ago. Heard her begging you to stop. She looked at Vincent with something that might have been pity once, but had curdled into disgust. We heard the scissors. Mr. Davidson stepped forward, his jaw tight. We saw you dragging furniture out at 2 o'clock in the morning, loading it into trucks, selling everything that wasn't nailed down. His eyes found Maya behind Kodiak's protective frame. We saw her stop going to school months ago. Saw her watching from the window while other kids walked by. The Martinez family's teenage daughter spoke next, her voice shaking but determined. She asked me once if I had any extra lunch, said she was hungry. I gave her my sandwich and she cried. The girl's hands were fisted at her sides. I should have told someone. I should have done something. One by one, they spoke. These neighbors who'd been silent conspirators in neglect, finally finding their voices now that someone else had been brave enough to act first. The truth built like a tidal wave, each testimony adding weight and momentum until Vincent was drowning in it. His excuses meaningless against the accumulated evidence of his failures. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain it away, but his voice was lost in the growing chorus of witnesses. His face had gone from pale to flushed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. He looked around desperately for an ally, for anyone who might take his side, and found nothing but judgment staring back. The Iron Wolves never laid a hand on Vincent. They didn't have to, because what happened next, nobody had called for, but everybody had been waiting for. The sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. The sirens started as distant wails, barely audible over the testimonies still being spoken, but they grew louder with each passing second until they dominated the soundscape of Willow Street. Vincent's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes going wide with the kind of panic that comes from knowing escape is no longer possible. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't save him. Explanations that had run out of credibility 3 testimonies ago. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner, lights flashing, and pulled up to the curb. The officers stepped out with the practiced calm of people who'd been called to domestic situations 1,000 times before. But even they paused when they saw the scene. 20 Iron Wolves standing in silent formation. A small girl with a shaved head hiding behind the largest man any of them had ever seen. And neighbors gathered like an impromptu town hall meeting. All pointing at the same sweating, stammering man on the porch. Mrs. Chen stepped forward before the officers could ask. "I called you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I should have called months ago, but I called now. That man shaved his daughter's head and sold her hair for gambling money. He's been abusing and neglecting her for years, and we all stood by and let it happen." The floodgates opened then. Neighbors rushed to speak with the officers, tripping over each other to give statements they should have given long ago. The furniture being sold at odd hours. The crying heard through thin walls. Maya disappearing from school. The gradual deterioration of a childhood happening in plain sight while everyone pretended not to see. Guilt has a way of making people talkative once they finally decide to speak. The officers took notes, their expressions growing harder with each statement. One of them approached Kodiak, who kept Maya positioned behind him, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Sir, we'll need to speak with the child." "Her name is Maya," Kodiak said quietly, "and you'll speak gentle or you won't speak at all." The officer looked up at Kodiak's face, saw something there that suggested this wasn't a negotiation, and nodded. "Yes, sir." "Maya, can you tell me what happened?" Maya's voice was small but clear. She told them about the scissors, about her hair being sold, about being pulled from school, about living in a house that had been stripped of everything, including her dignity. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere between the gas station and here. She just spoke the truth in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be. The senior officer's jaw tightened as he listened. When Maya finished, he looked at his partner and gave a single nod. They approached Vincent together, and the charges came out in a litany that sounded like judgment being read in a courtroom. Child abuse, neglect, endangerment, exploitation of a minor. Each word landed like a hammer blow, and Vincent seemed to shrink with every syllable. "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Vincent tried one last time. "She's lying. She's just a kid. She doesn't understand. I was going to pay it all back. I just needed one more." The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, cutting off his excuses mid-sentence. The sound was final, metallic, the sound of consequences arriving 3 years too late, but arriving nonetheless. The officers led him toward the patrol car and Vincent turned his head, looking back at his daughter one last time. Maybe searching for forgiveness. Maybe just trying to remember what she looked like before he destroyed her. Maya stood behind Kodiak and stared back at her father. She didn't look away. Didn't flinch. Didn't cry. She just watched as he was placed in the back of the car. Watched as the door closed. Watched as the vehicle pulled away with the man who was supposed to protect her but had sold her piece by piece instead. Most people would think the story ends here. Bad father goes to jail. Little girl is safe. Justice served. Roll credits. But what the Iron Wolves did next. That's the part that broke every rule. The part that transformed this from a rescue into something nobody expected. If you believe people who hurt children deserve everything coming to them, smash that subscribe button. Let's make sure predators know they're being watched. Because Maya's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The patrol cars disappeared around the corner, taking Vincent toward a future measured in court dates and prison sentences. And suddenly, Maya stood alone on the cracked sidewalk, feeling smaller than she had all day. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation drained away, leaving behind the cold reality of what came next. She had no father now, no home, no family, just a shaved head and trauma that would take years to unpack. A white sedan pulled up and a woman in her 40s stepped out carrying a clipboard and wearing the practiced smile of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Social services. Maya recognized the type from when kids at school would disappear into the system, never to return. The woman approached with gentle steps, already pulling forms from her clipboard, already planning Maya's future without asking what Maya wanted. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Ms. Thompson. I'm with Child Protective Services." She knelt down to Maya's level, that smile never wavering. "You're very brave for speaking up today. We're going to take care of you now. I'm going to place you in a foster home where you'll be safe while we sort everything out." Maya's face fell. The fear that had just started to recede came rushing back. Different, but just as suffocating. Foster care. She'd heard the stories from kids at school. The ones who got bounced from home to home, who carried their lives in garbage bags, who learned not to unpack because they'd just be moving again, one prison for another, just with different bars. Kodiak saw the change in her expression, saw hope dying in her eyes before it had even fully formed. He looked at his brothers and something passed between them without words, the way it always did when something important needed deciding. Raven pulled out his phone, then Brutus, then half a dozen others, stepping away to make calls with voices too low to hear, but urgent enough to understand. Ms. Thompson noticed, her professional smile faltering slightly as she watched these leather-clad men suddenly become very interested in their phones. "Is there something?" Kodiak stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Ma'am, before you take her anywhere, I've got some questions." Ms. Thompson blinked. "I'm sorry. Are you family?" "Her uncle rode with us for 8 years. Marcus Reyes, good man. He'd want us looking after his niece." Kodiak's voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "What's the process for custody? What would someone need to qualify as a foster parent? What about family, friends, people she already knows and trusts?" The social worker's confusion was evident. She wasn't used to bikers asking about legal processes and custody requirements. She was used to taking children away from dangerous situations, not having dangerous-looking men ask how to keep them. "Well, there's a process. Background checks, home studies, interviews, training." "How long does it take?" This from Raven, phone still pressed to his ear. "Typically several months, but in emergency placements." "What if someone already has clearances, already been through background checks?" Brutus asked, his phone conversation paused. Ms. Thompson looked around at these men who moments ago had been silent enforcers of justice and were now asking questions that sounded like they'd been researching family law. Well, That would expedite things, but I still need to place her somewhere tonight, and unless one of you is willing to undergo emergency foster certification. I am, Kodiak said. My wife and we've been certified before. Lost our daughter to leukemia 6 years ago. Tried fostering after. Couldn't handle it. Let the certification lapse, but we can get it reinstated. How fast? The social worker's clipboard lowered slowly. She stared at Kodiak like he'd just started speaking a language she didn't know he knew. Behind him, other bikers were still on their phones and fragments of conversation drifted over. Yeah. I need you to pull Marcus Reyes's family records. Check if there's any living relatives with custody rights. Also, start the paperwork for emergency placement approval. Maya watched all of this with wide eyes, not quite believing what she was hearing. These men who'd ridden to her rescue weren't just protecting her for an afternoon. They were talking about custody, about legal rights, about keeping her, about not letting her disappear into a system that chewed up kids and spit them out broken. The Iron Wolves weren't just protecting Maya for a day. They were about to do something the club had only done 3 times in its entire history. Something that would change not just Maya's life, but the very definition of what family could mean. The clubhouse sat on the edge of town in a converted warehouse that had seen better days, but wore its scars with pride, much like the men who gathered there. By 8 that evening, 20 bikers sat around a scarred wooden table that had hosted 1,000 meetings over 3 decades, but none quite like this one. In a side room, Maya slept on a couch under a blanket one of the old ladies had tucked around her, exhausted from a day that had contained more emotion than most people experience in a year. Elena, Kodiak's wife, sat in a chair beside her, reading a book, but mostly just watching the small chest rise and fall with each breath, making sure this child knew, even in sleep, that someone was keeping watch. The main room was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of serious silence that only falls when men who face down real danger recognize they're about to face something harder. Kodiak stood at the head of the table, his hands flat on the wood, his voice low, but carrying to every corner. We all know why we're here. That little girl sleeping in the next room is Marcus Reyes's niece. Marcus rode with us for 8 years, bled with us, had our backs when things got ugly. He's gone now. Cancer took him before he could meet her, but his blood runs in her veins, and his sister trusted us enough to keep that patch all these years. Raven spoke up, his fingers drumming on the table. I pulled the records. Maya's mother, Sophia Reyes, married Vincent Carter against Marcus's advice. Marcus told me once he tried to warn her the guy was trouble, but she was in love and thought she could fix him. After Marcus died, Sophia kept the jacket but never reached out to the club. Probably too proud, probably too ashamed of how things turned out. The girls got nobody, Brutus added, his voice rougher than usual. Father's going away for a long time. Mother's been dead 3 years. No other relatives we can find. She goes into the system, she becomes another statistic. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Most of the men around that table had seen the system up close. Either as kids who'd been through it themselves or as adults who'd watched it fail people they cared about. Foster care could be salvation for some, but for others it was just a different kind of abandonment. A rotating door of temporary families who never quite became permanent. Kodiak straightened up. Elena and I talked. We want to take her. We've got the room. We've got the means. And we've had foster certification before. Let it lapse after we lost Emma. Couldn't handle having kids in the house after that. But this feels different. This feels like Marcus reaching out from wherever he is and asking us to finish what he started, protecting his family. The vote was unanimous. 20 hands raised without hesitation, without debate, without the usual back and forth that accompanied major club decisions. Maya wasn't just some kid they'd helped that afternoon. She was legacy. She was blood. She was family in the way the Iron Wolves understood family. Chosen, earned, sealed by loyalty rather than genetics. Phones came out again. The club's lawyer, a former member who'd gotten his degree late in life, was pulled from dinner with his family and started drafting paperwork before his food got cold. Members with connections in social services called in favors. Others began the process of expediting background checks, home studies, character references. The mountain of bureaucracy that normally took months was being attacked from 20 different angles simultaneously. Each man bringing whatever skills or connections he had to bear on the problem. Comment: family, if you believe real family is the one that chooses you, not the one you're born into. By midnight, the foundation was laid. Kodiak and Elena's emergency foster certification was being fast-tracked. Temporary custody had been arranged, pending full approval, and Maya, sleeping in the next room with no idea what was being built around her, would wake up tomorrow not as a ward of the state, but as a member of the Iron Wolves family, the rarest honor the club could bestow. Maya woke up to sunlight streaming through curtains that weren't torn or stained, lying in a bed that didn't creak with broken springs, under sheets that smelled like lavender detergent instead of mildew and neglect. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, and panic started to rise in her chest until she heard the sound of someone humming in another room and smelled something she hadn't smelled in 3 years. Bacon frying, eggs being scrambled, coffee brewing, the smell of a real breakfast made by someone who cared whether you ate it. She found Elena in the kitchen, Kodiak's wife, a woman with kind eyes and strong hands who'd lost her own daughter, and somehow found room in her broken heart for another little girl who needed saving. Elena smiled when Maya appeared in the doorway, hesitant and uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. "Good morning, sweetie. I hope you're hungry. I made enough for an army." Maya stood frozen, staring at the plates piled with food, not moving toward the table. Elena noticed the hesitation, recognized it for what it was. A child who'd been taught that food was conditional, that nothing was truly hers, that everything could be taken away. She set down the spatula and knelt to Maya's level. "Everything here is yours, sweetie. The food, the bed you slept in, the clothes we're going to get you today. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to earn it. It's just yours because you're here and you're ours now." The shopping trip that afternoon was Maya's first lesson in what it meant to be chosen. Elena took her to real stores, not thrift shops or donation centers, and let her pick out clothes that fit and didn't smell like someone else's life. Maya kept asking if things were too expensive. Kept reaching for the clearance rack. Couldn't quite believe she was allowed to want things. Elena gently guided her toward quality, toward colors Maya actually liked, toward a wardrobe that would make her feel like a person who mattered. School enrollment came next. Kodiak sat across from the principal's desk, filling out forms with careful handwriting, answering questions about Maya's situation with a directness that left no room for judgment. Yes, she'd been pulled from school illegally. Yes, she'd suffered abuse. No, that wouldn't be happening again. The principal looked at this massive man covered in tattoos and leather and saw something he hadn't expected. A father who gave a damn. The counselor session started the following week. A gentle woman named Dr. Patel who specialized in childhood trauma and didn't push Maya to talk faster than she was ready. They processed what had happened piece by piece, building coping mechanisms and trust in equal measure. Maya learned that her worth wasn't tied to her hair or her usefulness or how little space she took up in the world. She learned that healing was messy and nonlinear and okay. Her new room became a project that involved the entire club. Maya chose purple for the walls, a soft lavender that Elena said reminded her of spring flowers. Over the next 2 weeks, club members showed up with furniture they'd either bought or built themselves. Brutus arrived with a solid oak desk he'd refinished. Raven brought a bookshelf and 50 books to fill it. A member they called Pastor installed a reading lamp shaped like a crescent moon. Each piece was given with the kind of quiet care that men who weren't used to expressing emotion could manage. Their way of saying welcome home without using those words. Elena took her to a real salon where a stylist looked at Maya's growing back hair with professional assessment rather than pity. They shaped it, conditioned it, made it look intentional rather than damaged. Maya stared at herself in the mirror and saw a girl who looked cared for, who looked like someone's daughter. The weekly dinners at the clubhouse became ritual. Every Sunday, Maya would arrive with Kodiak and Elena to find the entire extended family waiting. The old ladies who'd married into the club fussed over her, making sure her plate was full. The bikers asked about school, about her week, about whether anyone was giving her trouble. She was checked on, accounted for, included in a way that made her feel less like a charity case and more like someone who belonged. Remember that little girl who ran down a dirt road with tears cutting through the dust on her face, running toward men she'd never met with nothing but desperate hope? Watch what happens when she walks back into school 3 months later, transformed by the family she chose and who chose her back. 3 months after that desperate run down a dirt road, Maya stood in front of the mirror in her purple bedroom and barely recognized herself. Her hair had grown back thick and healthy, falling past her shoulders now in soft waves that Elena had braided that morning with the kind of careful attention that made Maya's throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. She wore new jeans that actually fit, a sweater she'd chosen herself in a shade of blue that made her feel brave, and a backpack that didn't have someone else's name crossed out on the tag. She looked like a normal kid. She looked like someone who mattered. Kodiak and Elena walked her to school that morning, one on each side like bookends holding her steady. But they weren't alone. 5 other club members had shown up on their bikes. Brutus, Raven, Pastor, a woman they called Spark, and old Bobby who'd ridden with Marcus Reyes back in the day. They rolled up to the school in formation, engines rumbling, chrome catching the morning sunlight in brilliant flashes that announced their presence blocks away. The kids arriving for school stopped and stared. Conversations died mid-sentence. Parents clutching coffee cups froze on the sidewalk. Whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd gathering outside the entrance. Maya heard fragments as she walked past. That's her, the girl who's dad. Those are the bikers who. I heard. They did. You see. But none of it touched her the way it might have before. She walked between Kodiak and Elena with her head held high, and behind them came 5 bikers who treated her escort to school like it was the most important ride of their lives. Teachers watched from classroom windows, faces pressed to glass, not sure what to make of this procession. Some looked concerned, some confused, some moved by something they couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't how kids usually arrived at school. This was how royalty arrived, how someone important arrived, how a girl who'd been treated like nothing was now being treated like everything. Maya walked like she owned the sidewalk. And maybe in that moment, she did. The kids who used to know her, the ones who'd watched her disappear from class months ago and hadn't asked questions, stared with wide eyes. Some looked guilty. Some looked odd. All of them looked like they were seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the world order they thought they knew. The principal emerged from the front entrance. Mr. Sullivan, a man who'd been in education for 30 years and thought he'd seen everything. His expression cycled through concern to confusion to something like alarm as he took in the scene. This small girl surrounded by leather and chrome and men who looked like they could dismantle his school with their bare hands if they felt so inclined. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Sullivan asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being in charge, but uncertain if that authority applied to these particular visitors. Kodiak stepped forward, not aggressive, but immovable. A mountain that had decided to have a conversation. "No problem, sir. Just walking Maya to her first day back. We're her family. We'll be picking her up every day at 3:15. Any problems with that?" The question hung in the air, polite, but leaving no room for the wrong answer. Mr. Sullivan looked at Kodiak, at the other bikers standing in silent solidarity, at Elena with her gentle smile, and then at Maya. And Maya was smiling, genuinely smiling in a way the principal had never seen before when she'd been enrolled here the first time. Her hand was tucked safely in Elena's. Her shoulders were back. Her eyes were clear. She looked protected. She looked loved. She looked like a child who knew with absolute certainty that people had her back. Mr. Sullivan's expression softened. "No problems at all," he said quietly. "Welcome back, Maya. We're glad to have you here." Maya turned at the entrance, looked back at her family standing on the sidewalk. Kodiak gave her a small nod. Elena blew her a kiss. The other bikers waved. These rough, scarred men waving at an 8-year-old girl like she was the most precious thing in their world. Because to them, she was. She represented something they all believed in, even if they couldn't always put it into words, that family was choice, that protection was sacred, that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight looked like showing up to elementary school drop-off on a Harley. Maya waved back, her smile bright enough to rival the sun, and then turned and walked through the doors into her new life. Behind her, the bikers didn't leave. They stood there in formation. Engines off now. Just watching until she disappeared inside. Making sure she made it safely. Making sure anyone watching understood that this girl was claimed, protected, loved by people who took those words seriously. Hit that like button if you're wiping tears right now. Share this story if you know someone who needs to see that broken things can be made whole again. The other students parted for Maya as she walked down the hallway toward her classroom. And if she walked a little taller than she used to, if she smiled a little brighter, if she carried herself like someone who finally understood her own worth, well, she'd earned that. She'd survived the worst kind of betrayal and found the best kind of family on the other side. 6 months can change everything when you're 8 years old and finally safe. Maya's new normal looked nothing like her old life. And every single day she woke up almost surprised that it was real, that it wasn't going to disappear, that this was actually hers to keep. Weeknight evenings found her at the kitchen table doing homework while Elena cooked dinner. The house filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes and whatever casserole was in the oven. Maya would work through her math problems, tongue sticking out in concentration, and Elena would glance over occasionally to check her progress, offering help when needed, but mostly just letting her figure things out. Sometimes Kodiak would come home from work at the auto shop and ruffle her hair as he passed, leaving a smudge of grease that made Maya laugh and Elena pretend to scold him. It was ordinary. It was domestic. It was the kind of boring, beautiful normal that Maya had spent years believing she'd never have. Weekends meant rides on the back of Kodiak's bike. Maya wearing her own helmet now, bright purple with silver stars that she'd picked out herself. She'd learned to lean into the turns, to trust the rumble of the engine beneath her, to find freedom in the wind and the open road. Kodiak would take her on long rides through the mountains, stopping at diners where waitresses learned her name and her order, creating memories that felt like the foundation of something permanent being built brick by brick. The club barbecues became Maya's favorite part of the rhythm they'd established. Every other Sunday, the clubhouse yard would fill with families, members, and their partners, kids running wild, the smell of burgers on the grill, and the sound of laughter that wasn't forced or polite, but real and messy and alive. Maya ran with the other kids, played tag and hide and seek. Finally had friends who didn't know the worst parts of her story, who just knew her as Kodiak's daughter, and treated her accordingly. She belonged to something bigger than herself now. Part of a web of connection that stretched across generations. Her 9th birthday came in November, and the club threw her a party that would have been excessive if it hadn't been so clearly motivated by love. The clubhouse was decorated with purple streamers and balloons. There was a cake shaped like a motorcycle that must have cost a fortune. Every single member showed up with gifts. Some practical like clothes and books. Some ridiculous like the giant stuffed bear from Brutus that was taller than Maya herself. She blew out her candles surrounded by 20 bikers singing off-key. And when they asked what she wished for, she said, "Nothing. I already have everything." Half the old ladies cried. Christmas morning brought its own kind of magic. Maya woke up to find presents piled under a real tree that Kodiak and Elena had let her help decorate. Each ornament chosen with care. Each strand of lights positioned with the kind of attention that said, "This matters. You matter. We're building traditions here." She opened gifts until wrapping paper covered the living room floor. Art supplies and winter coats and books and a new bike and things she needed mixed with things she just wanted because both were equally important to a family that could finally afford to show love in tangible ways. Elena took photos of everything, determined to document this first real Christmas, these first real family memories. Proof that this was permanent and precious and theirs. School became something Maya actually enjoyed instead of endured. Her grades climbed from barely passing to honor roll as she discovered what she could do when she wasn't constantly afraid, constantly hungry, constantly worried about what disaster waited at home. She made friends, real friends who invited her to sleepovers and birthday parties, who saved seats for her at lunch, who picked her first for teams in gym class. She joined the art club and discovered she had talent with charcoal and pastels, that she could take the things inside her head and put them on paper in ways that made teachers stop and really look. The moment came on a random Tuesday in February. Maya was helping Elena fold laundry, this ordinary domestic task that felt extraordinary because it was shared, because it was normal, because it was theirs. Elena was talking about something, maybe grocery shopping, maybe plans for the weekend. When Maya looked up and said it without thinking, the words slipping out naturally like it had been waiting for permission to exist. "Okay, Mom." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt infinite. Elena's hands froze mid-fold, clutching a towel, her eyes going wide, and then immediately wet. Maya realized what she'd said and froze, too, afraid she'd crossed some invisible line, afraid she'd presumed too much. But then, Elena dropped the towel and pulled Maya into a hug so tight it squeezed tears from both of them. And Kodiak appeared in the doorway with a smile so quiet and proud it didn't need words to explain what this meant. "Say it again," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom," Maya said. And this time, it wasn't an accident. It was a choice. It was a claim. It was the final piece of transformation clicking into place. Maya's hair had grown past her shoulders now, thick and healthy and beautiful in ways it had never been before, because now it was fed by proper nutrition and washed with good products and cared for by hands that loved her. Every morning she sat at Elena's vanity and braided it herself, having learned the pattern through patient instruction, taking pride in the skill because it was hers, because her hair was hers, because her body was hers, and nobody could take anything from her ever again. Sometimes she wore it down, sometimes she braided it. The choice itself was the victory. 1 year after that desperate run down a dirt road, Maya stood at the front of her 4th grade classroom in front of a poster board decorated with photographs and magazine cutouts, preparing to deliver a presentation that would have been impossible for the girl she used to be. The assignment was simple: what family means to me. But for Maya, nothing about family had ever been simple, and everything about it had become miraculous. Her teacher, Mrs. Anderson, gave her an encouraging nod. Maya took a breath, looked out at her classmates, and began. Her voice was steady, no trembling, no hesitation, none of the fear that used to live permanently in her throat, making every word a struggle. "Family isn't who you're born to," Maya said. And the classroom went quiet in the way it does when children sense something real is being spoken. It's who shows up when you need them most. In the back of the classroom, sitting in chairs meant for 9-year-olds, and looking absurdly large in them, Kodiak and Elena listened with the kind of attention that made time stop. They'd taken the afternoon off work to be here. Around them sat 5 other club members who'd somehow squeezed into the tiny classroom. Brutus leaning against the wall because no chair would hold him. Raven sitting cross-legged on the floor. Spark recording everything on her phone with tears already threatening. They wore their cuts proudly, those leather vests with patches that told stories of brotherhood and loyalty, looking completely out of place in this elementary school classroom and completely at home supporting this little girl. Maya's eyes found them in the crowd and her smile broke through, genuine and unguarded. "A year ago, my father took everything from me," she continued. And the classroom stayed silent. Even the kids who usually couldn't sit still. "He took my hair. He took my school. He took my safety and my dignity and everything that made me feel like a person. But what he couldn't take, what he didn't even know existed, was the family waiting for me." She gestured to her poster board covered in photos Elena had helped her print. Maya on the back of Kodiak's motorcycle. Maya blowing out birthday candles surrounded by bikers. Maya at Christmas morning. Maya at the clubhouse barbecue. A family that looked nothing like the ones in storybooks, but functioned better than most families that did. "I found a family that chose me," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They didn't have to. They could have just called the police and walked away. But they didn't. They protected me. They fought for me. They went through background checks and home studies and months of paperwork because they decided I was worth it." Her voice caught slightly, but she pushed through. "They loved me when I didn't know how to love myself." Elena was crying now, not bothering to hide it. Kodiak had his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Brutus had turned away, pretending to look at something on the wall. Raven was openly wiping his face with the back of his hand. These men who'd seen violence and hardship and loss were undone by this small girl speaking truth about what they'd done, about what it meant. "My teacher asked us to define family," Maya said, reaching her conclusion. "I think family is the people who show up. The people who stay. The people who see you at your worst and don't leave. The people who teach you that you're worth protecting, worth loving, worth fighting for." She paused, looked directly at Kodiak and Elena, and I never cried alone again. The classroom erupted in applause. Mrs. Anderson was wiping her eyes. Several students were clapping with genuine enthusiasm instead of the obligatory politeness usually reserved for presentations. But Maya only had eyes for her family in the back, and they were standing now, clapping louder than anyone, pride radiating from them like heat. After class, Maya walked out of the school building into afternoon sunshine that felt like blessing. Kodiak was waiting by his bike, helmet already in hand, the small purple one with silver stars. He didn't say anything when she approached, just held out the helmet and smiled that quiet smile that said more than words could. Maya took the helmet, secured it carefully, and climbed onto the back of the bike like she'd done it 1,000 times before, because she had. This was routine now. This was normal. This was home in the form of chrome and leather and the steady presence of a man who'd chosen to be her father when her real father had failed so catastrophically at the job. She wrapped her arms around Kodiak's waist, feeling the solid reality of him, the permanentness of this connection they'd built. The engine roared to life beneath them. And Elena pulled up alongside on her own bike. She'd learned to ride in the past year. Said if she was going to be part of this family, she needed to understand what it meant to feel that freedom. Other club members fell into formation around them. An escort home that was both protection and celebration. They rode through town as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting everything gold and orange and purple. Maya's favorite color now. The color of her room, her helmet, her transformation. Her laughter carried on the wind, pure and unrestrained. The sound of a child who'd learned what it meant to be safe, to be chosen, to belong to something bigger than survival. Cars pulled over to let them pass. People on sidewalks stopped to watch this convoy of motorcycles with a small girl at the center, protected and precious. Some of them remembered the day 20 bikers had shown up at Vincent Carter's house. Some of them remembered being silent witnesses to abuse they'd done nothing to stop. All of them could see the ending now. Could see that sometimes the story doesn't end in tragedy. Sometimes the monsters are defeated and the child gets saved and family means exactly what it's supposed to mean. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and real family, subscribe right now. Comment, "Never alone," if you're standing against child abuse and for the people brave enough to step in. Share this story with someone who needs to know that darkness doesn't last forever. Because Maya's story is real in all the ways that matter. It's about choosing to show up, choosing to protect, choosing to love even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Thank you for riding with Maya's story. Stay strong, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next one. The motorcycles disappeared into the sunset, engines rumbling, chrome gleaming, carrying home a little girl who'd run toward hope and found family waiting. And somewhere in that convoy, wrapped in leather and protected by love, Maya smiled and held on tight, knowing with absolute certainty that she would never cry alone again.